In this video, we're going to go over the basics of setting up an application with the Bungie API. For some reason, at least at the time of recording, there's not really any guide on YouTube for this kind of stuff, right? I've gone through a bunch of different searches here, and there's just no guides for the API at all. So here we are. I'm making the first one apparently. Yeah, let's just get into it. So first thing you want to do is you're going to want to create an application with Bungie, right? This is going to give you an API key as well as other things necessary to actually make some kind of API integration. So you're going to want to click create new app. You can see I've got a couple already, but we're going to ignore that. You've got your name, you've got your website, just standard information of it. And then you've got authentication. So this is something you have to kind of think about from the beginning. What do you need? And obviously you can change this all later as well, but this is something you should kind of already have figured out. What information does your integration need, right? You can see the scope here. These are all the things that are covered under authentication where you need to have some kind of authorization token to access these things. We've got vault inventory and vendors, as well as the Destiny 1 vault and inventory data. You've got your Destiny 1 vendor advisor information. You've got permissions to move a player's gear around. You've got permissions to do some admin controls on clans and groups, as well as accessing stuff like the Bungie.net notifications and all that good stuff, which the last one, I'm not really sure what use it has, but I'm sure it's useful somewhere. And then the redirect URL, you don't have to worry about this until later when you're actually doing authorization. If nothing in the scope interests you, you can just set the client type to not applicable, and you can move on with your day. Otherwise, you've got two types to choose from. You've got public and you've got confidential. The public one is a very kind of quick but ephemeral method where when you get authorized to do something, you only have that authorization for a small amount of time. This is good for things like maybe inventory managers where you don't really need to have an authorization from a user for a long time. The user's just going to be in there for a bit, do their thing, and leave. With confidential, it's the opposite. You get a token that you can refresh and continue to refresh up to a year. The downside is that you have to store this token and to have a bunch of considerations to make sure that's working. But that's very good if you're trying to collect data from players over a long period of time and whatnot. And there's plenty of other applications. But yeah, those are your two types of clients. Now you've got the origin header. This is used by Bungie to make sure that when you make a request, it's made by you and not someone trying to impersonate you. The way that you check this is by making a request through your browser using its developer tools. And it shows the origin of, okay, this came from so-and-so website in their request. And that's what Bungie's checking with the origin header. It's comparing to that. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at the origin in your request, that you set the origin header to that. And again, this all can change after the fact, right? You don't have to fill this all in immediately. But I want to make sure that you know what's going on in here. Now, I'm not going to create a new app because I already have one set up. You can see here that I've got a confidential client that reads inventory data as well as gear. You see that now that we've created a bot, that there's an API key, client ID, and a client secret. These are all important for actually making requests. So what actually are requests? We're going to go now into the Bungie API. This is their official documentation. They explain every single request and show every single request. Some of the explanations are better than others. Some things don't have explanations, some do. Most of the important things have explanations. Or, well, I shouldn't say important. Most of the high traffic requests have explanations and whatnot. The Bungie API is an API, right? The way that you communicate with it is through HTTP requests, or just requests. The way that you actually make requests is very different depending on your language, as well as the library that you're using within that language. So obviously I can't cover every single combination, right? Instead, I'm going to be using this tool called Postman. This gives us a kind of GUI to work with. That gives you kind of an intuitive way to see requests. And a very nice thing about it is that you can open up your request as code and just copy this into whatever you're doing. And it's got plenty of functionality. So highly recommend doing this. One thing to note though, if you do this, it makes a cookie header which is not yours. This is not something you have to worry about. You can completely remove this, and you should, because that's not part of what you're doing. But we're going to get back to this. You can also test requests manually through the Destiny Data Explorer. This has every single GET request, which I'll come back to, that you can make in the API. This lets you autofill any of your relevant data. So if you go here, you can see it autofills my Destiny ID and my type. So it kind of skips a lot of steps so that you can just see the data and make sure you know what requests you're making before you have to set up everything for it. That said, you do have to set everything up for it after you do it through here, because this will not give you any code for it, and this won't fill in your API key or your authorization token for you. This won't do any of that for you. This is using its own API key, its own token, so you still have to kind of go through Postman or whatever to make sure that your request is right after you're sure what you're doing. If you go back to Bungie's API, we can scroll down and we can see all these requests here. These are endpoints, that's what we call these. We can see that most of these endpoints are taking GET requests, as well as a couple taking POST requests. And you get more as you kind of go down as well. These are the two main types of requests you have to deal with a Bungie API, which is GET and POST. With GET requests, you're getting data from the API, and you can see that you specify things to kind of narrow down that data. With POST requests, you're sending data, and then you're getting back some kind of response from the API. So how do we actually make a request? Right. To start, let's look at some of the components to most requests in Destiny. So we're gonna go back to Postman here, and this is a real request that I'm using right now in my application, though I made this a while ago, so I don't remember exactly what all these parameters do. But you can see that there's a couple types of parameters. So you can see here, there are parameters that are directly embedded in the URL. Some are at the end after this question mark, and some are within it. So these ones within the URL itself, we call these URL parameters. Most of the time, this will be stuff like your Destiny membership ID, a character ID, a membership type, stuff like that. And then at other times, like for components, these are query parameter where it's put at the end. And you can see we have a bunch of components here. There's two other ways of sending data within a request, which are in the headers and in the body. There's also ways to authorize it. So if you're using OAuth 2, you're going to put your access token in here like so, and you're going to give it the bearer header. And headers, for basically any request within the Bungie API, you're going to be using X API key. And this is where you're going to put your API key. There's also other things that go to your headers depending on the request itself. Again, defer to documentation, as with most things for this. And then in the body, in this case, we don't have anything because this is a GET request. But if you're making a POST request, your body may look something like this instead. For these kinds of POST requests, you're going to want to tell it what type of body it is. Because you can see there's a couple ways up here that it can be formatted. So you want to let the Bungie API know, hey, this is a URL encoded form. These are all the components of a request that you have to worry about. One thing I want to quickly note before we move on is within Postman, you can set the type of request over here. I think I forgot to mention that earlier. So let's kind of go through the process of getting the equipment that a character has equipped from scratch. So we're going to begin just with our Bungie membership ID. So if you go to your user profile here, that's where you're going to be able to see this right up in these two URL parameters. This first one is going to be your membership type, and this is your membership ID. So first thing we want to do, we're going to want to look at our linked profiles. What this request does is show us what Destiny accounts are associated with this Bungie membership ID. So we go into Postman. I should have it already set up. Yep, you can see here that this is the same membership type as we have here. If you click send, we get all this data here. What we're looking for specifically is our profiles, and then within that we have our membership type and membership ID. Now our next step is to access this profile. So we see that we have our membership type and Destiny membership ID, and then we have components 200. Why do I have 200 there? If we go into Destiny component type, we could see that characters falls under component 200. This will give us summary info about any character that we're looking at. So we go back here and we send this. And here we can see all of our character data here. But obviously these are a bunch of numbers. We don't know what's going on here. So I'm actually going to switch over to Destiny Data Explorer. The good thing with this is that it gives explanations for everything that you see, and you can autofill everything, so that's nice. And if we send this, we can see that on this profile we have this character, which is a Titan, and it's associated with the membership ID we provided. If we copy this character ID, we're now going to go, and I'm just going to stick within the Data Explorer now because the data just gets weirder to work with, or sorry, it gets less human readable. And now within here, we have the component's character equipment, which is component 205. We send this, we've got all the equipment. You can see that I currently have Servant Leader, Hardlight, and his inventions on. So yeah, that's kind of a quick run through of some requests you have to make, but there is a trick here. Instead of going and making this separate request here, we could go into get profile and we can just say character equipment here. If I send this, you'll see all the items, same as before, show up here under my character's ID. And if I had multiple characters, there would be multiple IDs here, and each one would have the equipped items attached to it. This is a very nice property in the Bungie API where these components can trickle down. So from a profile level, we can look at all the character equipment for each character. And this applies if I look at, for example, character activities. Again, I've only got one character, so it's only going to show one, but you can access every single character's latest activity and whatnot. And this allows us to get data on multiple characters within the same profile with less requests. But why do we care about making less requests to begin with? There's two real reasons that you would want to do that. First of all, requests take some time. Like, if I do this, You see it's sending, and then it takes a second, and then it's here, right? Requests take a bit of time to process, and for your application, you want things to be running as fast as possible, meaning you want to reduce the amount of times it's stopping to make a request and get the response, and then continue. Second thing is that Bungie directly has a rate limit on their API. You can only make 250 requests in 10 minutes, or another easier way to think of it is 25 requests per second. The reason they do this is to keep a handle on how much load their API is taking, which in turn makes sure that everything runs smoothly. There have been times in the past where there's a lot of traffic and they had to actually lower the rate limit. So as much as you can, reducing the requests means that your application is more scalable, meaning as more people use it, it's less likely to start hitting that rate limit. Now, we're about to get into two requests that are pretty important for most applications. Before that though, I do want to ask you to leave a like and subscribe if you've gotten this far. This is a very small channel as you can see, so anything kind of counts to make sure this video gets seen by more people and also, just to help the channel. With that said, let's get back into it. So the Destiny manifest, if you go here, you see that this is a request. There are no parameters, but what it returns is a bunch of links. So this seems very cryptic, doesn't it? But no, what this refers to is actually data for all of the common data between players. So this is going to be like activities, data about items, data about armor. And it should be noted, these are common data, not instance data. So my specific servant leader isn't in there, but the general data for servant leaders, such as its name, the image for it, as well as some other stuff, that's all in here. The catch is that the data is very weird to get. You can see these are content files. I've never seen a content file in my life before this. So what do we do with this? How do we get this data? The specific path here that gives you most of the data that you'll want is under mobile world content paths. And you can see this has stuff for a bunch of different languages. We're going to use English because I don't speak any of the other languages. And we're going to make a new tab. We're going to say bungie.net slash this. And I've got 2 slashes there. And you see that downloads a content file to my computer. So this first file here is actually a zip file. So this is a zip file, we've extracted it, and now inside we find another content file. Now this content file is a SQLite 3 database. So yeah, you can see how people may get confused with this stuff. So obviously we have to view the database now. What I use to view it is just this SQLite browser. Nothing special about it, I just found it off Google and it works. So I'm gonna go back here, I'm just gonna open it up. Here we open up the database and now we can see everything inside of it. We've got achievements, activities, bonds, classes, damage types, energy types. Basically anything that isn't specific to a player, you can find it in here. Only exception being, I think, render data, because that's stored separately. You can also find all the lore, so you can data mine stuff all of this. And let's see how it's stored. It's stored as kind of key value pairs of an ID and then a bunch of JSON data. So let's go to the inventory items. And you can see that it has an ID and it has JSON. The IDs are in the range of an unsigned 32-bit integer, meaning it can go up to the integer max and down to the integer min. These can also be represented as a unsigned 64-bit integer. We can see in the JSON that this has a bunch of different properties. You can see the name, you can see the icons, as well as a bunch of other things here like the background color and all this good stuff. You're usually going to want to access all this data within some kind of code. However, again, the way that you do that is very dependent on the language and library, so there's not really a good way for me to explain all of that. But it's here for you, and there's ways that you can make use of this data. Now, if we move on, we can do authorization. So first of all, let's talk about why we authorize. Authorization gives us an access token, which allows us to access various protected actions and pieces of information. Stuff like character inventories, moving equipment around, all that good stuff, right? The stuff in the scope. This is stuff that you wouldn't want just any random guy to be able to do or see without your explicit permission. So authorization allows users to give this explicit permission, where they're sent to a login page, which then authorizes your app to do its thing, you know? The access token is valid for exactly 1 hour. As we talked about before with the public and confidential clients, with a public client, you can't refresh this token. But with the confidential client, when you get the access token, it sends you a refresh token as well. And you can use that refresh token to refresh the access token. And that refresh token is valid for much more than an hour. It's valid for 90 days, and that 90-day timer resets every time you make use of it up until 1 year passes from the original login. With public, you can store that token locally and get rid of it when you're not using it. Confidential though, you want to hold on to that token and refresh it when you need it. That's, the right way to do things. You can technically treat a confidential client as a public client, but it's inefficient and not best practice. So, how do we get this access token? The process is this. The user has to get to your specific authorization login page. When they log in, they're going to get sent back to a page that you specify. That is in the redirect URL. That's where they're going to get sent. They're going to have a query parameter. You remember, just like with a component, it's going to be like that. It's going to put that query parameter on your URL that you put in here with the authorization code. You're going to send that code with a post request to get an access token, which is associated with that code. And then if it's confidential, you're going to store the access token along with a refresh token in whatever format works best for you. So let's start with getting your app's authorization login page. When you create an application, Bungie gives you a client ID. You're going to put that in this URL where it says client ID. You're going to replace your client ID. So for me, that is here as 470. I'm going to put that here. If I click enter, you can see it sends me to a login page. You can see it's not configured for me to actually authorize and all that because I don't have a redirect URL set. But if we did have a redirect URL set and we signed in, it would send us back to our website. It would be, let's just say it's bungie.net because I think that'd be funny. Code equals, it's just gonna be like gibberish. It's a decently long string. Let's just say it's like that. And obviously this isn't a valid code. I've just like mashed my keyboard here. But what we're gonna do, we're gonna send this code to this endpoint as a post request with our authorization. This authorization is gonna use our client ID as a username and the client secret as a password. And you can see that's right here. We're gonna set in the headers our content type to be a URL encoded form. You'll note this is one of the few requests where we don't specify an API key because we're already authorizing it with this. And then in the body, this has two things. We've got our grant type, which is authorization code, and we've got our code, which is this that we've put. And this is going to give us a token as well as our refresh token if it's confidential, and it'll give an amount of seconds until the token expires. If we want to do a refresh token, it's a very similar process. The difference is that we set this value here to refresh token and this value. So these both turn into refresh token instead of authorization code. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. And yeah, that's all of the topics for kind of setting up a basic application within Bungie. And yeah, you can get on your way making whatever application you want from here. One thing I can't recommend enough is joining the Bungie developer Discord. People are very nice there. They'll answer any questions you have. And well, this API is very deep. There's so many things. So you almost certainly will need help, and that's where you can find it. With that, I'm going to once again ask you to like and subscribe because I need it. And thank you for watching.